It is proof of a base and low mind for one to wish to think with the masses or majority, merely because the majority is the majority. Truth does not change because it is, or is not believed by a majority of the people. Giordano Bruno, 1500s.
In our fast-paced, technologically advanced world, access to limitless amounts of information has never been greater. However, with this abundance of information comes a great deal of complexity and confusion. Because we can get overwhelmed, we often leave the interpretation of this avalanche of data to those that we might believe are experts. Unfortunately, the interpretation of facts and events can be manipulated and shaped by those in power to often reinforce their preconceived notions and serve their own agendas. Governments, institutions, companies, and organizations often try to control the narrative to maintain their hold on power and secure their profits, using the media as a tool to shape public opinion. As informed citizens, it is our responsibility to critically evaluate the information we are presented with, to question its authenticity and validity, and to seek out the truth. By using our innate intelligence to educate ourselves and break free from their control, we can empower ourselves to make informed decisions and take control of our own destinies. One area of particular interest to us is the topic of infectious diseases. By studying historical data, we can gain a deeper understanding of how these diseases have affected populations in the past and see if the measures taken to prevent or treat them were effective or necessary. This knowledge can help us make better decisions and take appropriate actions to protect ourselves and our communities.
The fatal tendency of mankind to leave off thinking about a thing when it is no longer doubtful is the cause of half their errors. John Stuart Mill, 1859.
Using government-collected data, let's look at the number of deaths caused by various infectious diseases. An excellent way to make sense of this information is to show it in a mortality chart. Let's specifically examine the measles mortality rate. In the United States, measles deaths have been recorded since 1900. We can use this data to create a chart that shows the number of measles-related deaths over time. The resulting chart shows that the number of measles deaths fluctuated over the years, but there was an overall trend of fewer deaths. As you can see on the chart, by the time the measles vaccine was introduced in 1963, the number of deaths caused by measles dropped dramatically by 98.6% from its highest point. In England, records of measles-related deaths have been kept since 1838. Like in the United States, the number of deaths from measles fluctuated over time. During the 1800s, the trend for measles deaths was relatively stable. However, towards the end of the century, a significant decline in fatalities began and continued throughout the 1900s. The measles vaccine was introduced in 1968. By then, the death rate for measles had decreased by an impressive 99.8% from its peak, nearly 100%. These charts are based on official data collected by the government, which is available for anyone to access. Governments, institutions, companies, and organizations could use this data to make informed decisions, yet this data has almost entirely been ignored. For instance, the CDC website has the same measles mortality chart we just looked at included in a Vital Statistics of the United States report from the 1960s. This information on measles mortality decline before a vaccine was used was sometimes recognized, though not commonly, in medical publications.
Before there was a vaccine, measles mortality had fallen to 0.03%, which is 1/200th of the 1908 Glasgow mortality rate of 5.8%, a 99.5% decrease. Clive E. West, Ph.D., 2000.
Let's examine another disease, whooping cough, also called pertussis. The vaccine was first used in the late 1940s. By then, deaths from whooping cough had already decreased by over 92%. Moreover, a trend line indicates no significant change in the downward trend in deaths from whooping cough after introduction of the vaccine. Once more, we see a similar pattern in England. During the 1800s, the deaths from whooping cough remained relatively constant. However, deaths significantly decreased towards the end of the century and throughout the 1900s. The whooping cough vaccine was introduced nationally in 1957, and by then, the death rate from whooping cough had decreased by an astonishing 99.7% from its highest point, almost 100%. This chart shows the deaths caused by whooping cough in England during the 1900s. In the 1970s, there was a public scare about the DTP vaccine possibly causing brain damage, which caused a significant decrease in the number of people vaccinated. However, with this decrease, there was no increase in deaths from whooping cough. This result wasn't surprising because whooping cough fatalities had already dropped to almost zero before introducing the vaccine.
In the United Kingdom and in many other countries, whooping cough and measles are no longer important causes of death or severe illness except in a small minority of infants who are usually otherwise disadvantaged. In these circumstances, I cannot see how it is justifiable to promote mass vaccination of children everywhere against diseases which are generally mild, which confer lasting immunity, and which most children escape or overcome easily without being vaccinated. Gordon T. Stewart, Emeritus Professor of Public Health, 1981.
In England during the 1800s, measles and whooping cough caused deaths ranging from 40 to 70 per 100,000 people, while scarlet fever was deadlier, causing 60 to 140 deaths per 100,000 people, almost double the number of deaths. Scarlet fever deaths followed a similar pattern to the previously mentioned diseases, measles and whooping cough. Towards the end of the 19th century, a significant decline in scarlet fever fatalities began and continued throughout the 1900s. Deaths from scarlet fever reached zero by the 1940s. However, unlike measles and whooping cough, there was no widely used scarlet fever vaccine. During the same time, deaths from other diseases such as typhoid and tuberculosis also declined. The flu vaccine was introduced in the 1970s. By then, deaths from the flu had already decreased by 90%. And even though flu vaccines have been available for 40 years, the yearly death rate from flu has not improved since the 1970s. In short, starting between 1870 and 1880, there was a decrease in deaths caused by illnesses like measles, whooping cough, scarlet fever, typhoid, tuberculosis, and others. This decline continued until the mid-1900s when deaths reached zero or near zero. Importantly, all these diseases declined virtually simultaneously, indicating an underlying common factor why they all did. And notably, this decline occurred before vaccines became widespread and sometimes even without the use of vaccines at all. This suggests that vaccines were not as necessary in reducing deaths as people commonly think. Similarly, despite widespread belief, medical treatments in general had little impact on overall mortality for these diseases.
In general, medical measures, both chemotherapeutic and prophylactic, appear to have contributed little to the overall decline in mortality in the United States since about 1900, having in many instances been introduced several decades after a marked decline had already set in and having no detectable influence in most instances. More specifically, with reference to those 5 conditions, influenza, pneumonia, diphtheria, whooping cough, and poliomyelitis, for which the decline in mortality appears substantial after the point of intervention, and on the unlikely assumption that all of this decline is attributable to the intervention, it is estimated that at most 3.5% of the total decline in mortality since 1900 could be ascribed to medical measures introduced for the diseases considered here. Sonia and John McKinley, 1977.
The human brain is a complex organ with the wonderful power of enabling man to find reasons for continuing to believe whatever it is that he wants to believe. Voltaire.
We live in a world of numbers. To most of us, numbers are real. They're concrete. They have a definite meaning. These numbers are used to tell us about the world, how we should live, and what we should do. In science, numbers can't ever be wrong or misleading. We expect that in scientific journals that the numbers presented are correct. The experts that use numbers never need to be questioned. It's science after all. But are those numbers always impartial? Could they be skewed because those that are presenting them are biased? Do the people providing these numbers have a subconscious or overt agenda? Could they be influenced by their beliefs, peers, or financial motives? Could they be victims of groupthink? For example, let's look at a very large and significant scientific paper titled Report on the Task Force on Pertussis and Pertussis Immunization, published in 1988 in the very prestigious peer-reviewed journal Pediatrics. Pertussis is another name for whooping cough. This is the very first paragraph. The authors clearly state that 5,000 to 10,000 people died of whooping cough before there was a vaccine, and now only 5 to 10 die. The authors clearly give 100% of the credit to mass immunization. In their report, the authors reference a document titled Historical Statistics of the United States Colonial Times to 1957. From this paper, we can chart the deaths from whooping cough from 1900 to 1957. The data is normalized for the population of the United States, so it shows deaths per 100,000 people. So it's true, as the authors assert, that between 1900 and 1924, anywhere from 5,000 to roughly 10,000 people died each year attributed to whooping cough. Another document from the CDC also showed that from about 1970 to the time of the study in 1988, there were approximately 5 to 10 annual deaths attributed to whooping cough. So in fact, the data the authors use is accurate, but when you look at all the charted data, it's evident that whooping cough deaths were declining before the widespread use of the vaccine. In fact, by the time the vaccine was being used, deaths had fallen from the peak by about 90%. 90% before mass immunization. And if we add a trend line from 1920 to 1957, it's clear that the vaccine really had no impact on the downward trend of whooping cough deaths. So while the numbers the authors presented in the paper were essentially correct, they neglected to show the entire picture and let the reader believe the deaths decreased entirely due to mass immunization, when the data actually shows it's completely untrue. Unfortunately, thousands and thousands of pediatricians and other doctors would have read this paper, or maybe even just read the first paragraph, and falsely believed the deaths were decreased by mass immunization. Let's look at another example. A paper titled Historical Comparisons of Morbidity and Mortality for Vaccine Preventable Diseases in the United States was published in 2007 in the Journal of the American Medical Association. Let's look at the table showing measles deaths. Again, all the data is correct, but there is a problem. Notice their analysis of average deaths starts in 1953, with the authors giving a 100% reduction credit to vaccination. But if we look back to the year 1900, we see something remarkable. The death rate before the vaccine was introduced in 1963 had fallen by over 98% from the peak. 98%. Unfortunately, anyone reading this article would have taken the author's numbers at face value and not realized this critical information was left out. So again, this study gives full credit to mass vaccination when clearly that was not the case. Here is another example that demonstrates a vaccine-only focus. This article, titled Measles Mortality in the United States 1971 to 1975, which was published in 1980 in an issue of the American Journal of Public Health. In that article, the authors show this chart that clearly shows a massive decline in deaths. The authors note a, quote, striking decline, end quote, in measles deaths after vaccination began in 1963. Yet this chart is specifically designed to show the tiny changes in the 1960s when measles deaths were already rare and falling. The same data displayed on a standard chart shows an over 98% decline in deaths from measles before the vaccine. Nowhere in the article is there any mention of a striking decline of 98% before the vaccine was introduced. The focus is 100% only on vaccination, and like other studies, anything that doesn't directly support that belief is ignored. And what about studies that look at other data? What about looking at data from England that started being collected back in 1838? It shows a massive decline in deaths from whooping cough before national vaccination in 1957, over 99%, almost 100%. Or studies looking at what happened when vaccination rates plummeted in the late 1970s after parents became worried about neurological damage from the vaccine. Where was the expected massive increase in deaths from whooping cough as vaccination rates fell? Does this make any sense? Shouldn't death rates have gone up? So these and other medical articles all neglect to discuss or even recognize the massive decline in deaths before vaccination programs began. The focus is always on vaccination and never on general solutions of what could have been and can be done to reduce deaths. It's all about the vaccine without considering anything else that works to save lives. Forget nutrition, lifestyle, and overall health. It's 100% vaccines and nothing else. Does that sound like unbiased science to you, or is it just dogma? The distressing problem is that all these biased studies published year after year, decade after decade, have left generations of doctors, nurses, and other healthcare professionals, and the majority of the public convinced that vaccination is the sole reason of what caused deaths from infectious diseases to vanish. More widely, it has embedded germ theory into the public consciousness instead of terrain theory, which the data shows to be a much better description of reality. The damage that has been and is being done to our health and our societies for this extreme medical bias is truly incalculable.
The immunization of the masses has been undertaken with almost a religious fervor. The enthusiast rarely stopped to wonder where it would all finish or whether the fulsome promises made to the public in the form of propaganda would ever be honored. Without propaganda there can, of course, be no large-scale immunization. But how perilous it is to mix up propaganda with scientific fact. If we baldly, in plain or basic language, told the whole truth, it is doubtful whether the public would submit to immunization. Accidents and mistakes must inevitably happen, and when they take place, what might have been a highly instructive lesson is usually suppressed or distorted out of recognition. Those who have had to take detailed notice of the immunization accidents of the past few years know that to get the truth of what really went wrong generally calls for the resources of something like the Secret Service. Dr. Charles Oakle, 1939.
We can recognize the mistakes of our predecessors and those of some of our contemporaries. We wonder that the old-time doctor did not suspect that his lancet, used for bloodletting, his calomel, mercury, and tartar emetic, a violent and toxic purgative, especially by causing evacuation of the bowels, put many a patient underground, whose disease would have ended in recovery if it had been let alone. We are ready to admit frankly that in the past many patients have unquestionably died of the doctor. In fact, this very disease, variola, smallpox, is a case in point, for the change in the death rate as compared with earlier records leaves no possible doubt that mistaken treatment had more than anything else to do with the great mortality of the scourge, smallpox. Henry G. Hanchett, M.D., January 1889.
So, what is a vaccine? Where did this name come from? Where did the idea of making you sick to keep you healthy start? The first endeavor to prevent smallpox in the Western world began with Lady Mary Wortley Montagu in 1717. She returned from the Ottoman Empire with knowledge of a practice that entailed taking a small amount of material from a human smallpox lesion and scratching it onto another person's skin. This method was supposedly a way to protect someone from smallpox.
The smallpox, so fatal and so general amongst us, is here entirely harmless by the invention of engrafting, which is the term they give it. Every year thousands undergo this operation, and the French ambassador says, pleasantly, that they take the smallpox here by way of diversion, as they take the waters in other countries. There is no example of anyone that has died of it, and you may believe that I am well satisfied of the safety of this experiment. Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, letter to Miss Sarah Criswell, 1717.
This newfangled notion was quickly embraced by most of the medical profession. However, some pointed out that smallpox was not the deadly disease that people imagined, and that the risk of this new inoculation of smallpox was high and could result in death.
Inoculation is an art of giving smallpox to persons in health, who might otherwise have lived many years, and perhaps to a very old age without it, whereby some unhappily come to an untimely death. I hope there are but few such doctors. Miserable is the patient that employs them. I never saw such practice with design in my life, and yet have been an observer near 40 years in the practice of physic. What pitiful shifts are men driven to, when they have some unreasonable cause to maintain. In short, 'tis a practice against nature, and therefore cannot be a good one. I would advise them to change the word inoculation, and take incantation in its stead. I have one observation more to add, taken from the success of the smallpox in Christ's Hospital, where there is generally near 600 children, the nurseries at Ware and Hertford, constantly filling the places of those who go off. Here it hath sometimes happened, that great numbers have been down of the smallpox, and 'tis but seldom, that the house is free, yet in 20 years there have not died above 5 or 6 at most of that distemper, smallpox. And in the last 8 years there died but 1, and seldom above 5 or 6 in a year of all distempers, any disease that caused fever, so little need is there of inoculation. Isaac Massey, Apothecary to Christ's Hospital, 1722.
Even as far back as 1688, Thomas Sydenham, M.D., known as the English Hippocrates and the father of English medicine, noted that as long as the medical profession did not interfere, smallpox was not as severe and deadly a problem as it is usually portrayed.
Considering the practices that obtain, both amongst learned and ignorant physicians, it had been happy for mankind, that either the art of physic had never been exercised, or the notion of malignity never stumbled upon. As it is palpable to all the world, how fatal that disease proves to many of all ages, so it is most clear to me, from all the observations that I can possibly make, that if no mischief be done, either by physician or nurse, smallpox, is the most slight and safe of all other diseases. Thomas Sydenham, M.D., known as the English Hippocrates and the father of English medicine, 1688.
The inoculation procedure introduced in 1721 did not gain public acceptance until around 1748. In 1754, the Royal College of Physicians of London strongly endorsed inoculation. From 1748 to 1798, over the course of 50 years, public acceptance of physician-promoted smallpox inoculation continued to grow. Yet despite assurances from medical men of the ease and safety of this new medical procedure of inoculation, it could result in horrifying and painful deaths. And when the inoculation or other medical intervention caused the death of a patient, the patient was often blamed. Take this example of a 9-year-old girl from 1724, just a few years after the introduction of this novel operation. She was inoculated and later became extremely ill, despite the inoculators saying she would play the whole time. The poor girl was then bled by a doctor, a standard medical notion of the time, and then finally, after weeks of suffering, she died, and was blamed for her own death by people who should have taken responsibility for their actions.
When I determined by my friend's persuasion to have my daughter inoculated, I sent for Mr. Amiand. He declared himself very well satisfied with her state of health, and though I proposed having a physician to attend her, asked him whether there was not to be some preparation. He said there was no occasion for anything I had offered, that the child would be so well all the course of the disease that she would play about the room the whole time. About 5 or 6 days after the inoculation, she was seized with great pains in all her joints. The smallpox came out about the 10th or 11th day very violently. Soon after another doctor was called, who he said understood inoculation. Soon after their bleeding her there appeared a swelling upon one of her elbows. In 9 weeks after the inoculation, and after the most miserable suffering that ever poor creature underwent, she died worn to nothing but skin and bone. She had 36 running sores, none of them having ever been healed, when she died, and they were forced to roll up her joints in pasteboard, lest the joints should fall out of their places. I am very sensible of the reports which have been spread about her, and Mr. Amiand himself, as I said before, allowed her to be in a very good condition, and fit for the operation even without the help, either of a physician, or any preparation. It is very extraordinary to have such reports spread, and particularly that any man should talk in print of the irregular life of a child of 9 years old. The world may see by it the humanity of having such a misfortune aggravated, by the very people, who at least should show some repentance, for the misery they brought upon an afflicted mother. Mrs. Anne Rolt, September 16, 1724.
This chart, based on the London Bills of Mortality, shows that over 150 years, deaths from smallpox as a percentage of total deaths increased by more than 50% after the introduction of smallpox inoculation. The average rate of smallpox deaths during the 3 periods shown rose from 6.2% to 7.8% to 9.6%. Of particular note, a smallpox epidemic in 1796, just before the turn of the century, was responsible for over 18% of deaths. This was the highest percentage of deaths from smallpox in London during the 1700s, despite the highly promoted and profitable medical treatment of smallpox inoculation. So, with inoculation being promoted and performed, smallpox had become a much worse problem by the end of the 1700s. Again, some recognize that smallpox is a mild disease if handled properly without deadly medical treatment.
I consider even the natural smallpox a mild disease, and only rendered malignant by mistakes in nursing, in diet, and in medicine, and by want of cleanliness. It would hardly be too bold to say that the fatal treatment of this disease, for 2 centuries, by warming and confining the air of the chamber, and by stimulating and heating cordials, was the cause of 2/3 of the mortality which ensued. John Birch, member of the Royal College of Surgeons, London, 1814.
In 1796, nearly 1 in 5 deaths in London were caused by smallpox. As a result of worsening smallpox deaths, many, particularly among the educated and wealthy class, were eager to embrace something new that could replace inoculation and eradicate the seemingly never-ending plague. The stage was set for Edward Jenner and his notion of cowpoxing, later renamed vaccination.
It is a convenient habit of vaccinators to speak of vaccinations as uniform, as if the virus of the right were as definite as a drop of water, a pinch of salt, or a grain of gold. Nothing could be further from the truth. The virus called vaccine is not one but various, not uniform but multiform, not certain but uncertain, with an uncertainty which in transit from body to body, ad infinitum, can be predicted nor ascertained. The matter of his lancet he cannot define, and its effects he cannot foresee. To these Jennerian stocks have been added smallpox cowpox obtained by inoculating cows with the virus or pus of human smallpox. Thus we have virus derived from horse grease cowpox, from natural or spontaneous cowpox, from horsepox, and from smallpox cowpox, plus the constitutional taints of the generations of vaccinifers through which these diverse poxes have been passed. And which is which, and how modified for better or for worse in the course of travel, none can tell. Dr. T. V. Gifford, 1888.
It was noticed that the dirty hands of farm laborers who touched the teats or other sensitive parts of the cow produced the disorder called cowpox. Some people believed that milkmaids or others who came down with cowpox were not, as a rule, subject to smallpox during epidemics. Consequently, it became a matter of countryside gossip that cowpox was a preventative against getting smallpox. Edward Jenner heard and believed these rumors despite many reported cases of smallpox after cowpox. He made a slight variation on the already widespread medical use of inoculation. Instead of taking diseased material from a smallpox victim, he took diseased material from someone who appeared to be suffering from an animal-acquired disease. After some experiments, Edward Jenner quickly claimed his notion was perfectly safe and provided lifelong protection from smallpox infection. On March 17, 1802, Jenner petitioned the House of Commons and made the following declaration.
That your petitioner, having discovered that a disease which occasionally exists in a particular form among cattle, known by the name of cowpox, admits of being inoculated, vaccinated, on the human frame with the most perfect ease and safety, and is attended with the singularly beneficial effect of rendering through life the person so inoculated perfectly secure from the infection of smallpox. Edward Jenner, March 17, 1802.
But really, what was a vaccine made of? Edward Jenner did his famous experiment using pus obtained from a cow. Actually, he took material from a pus-filled sore on the hand of a dairymaid that Jenner claimed had been infected from milking cows. Then he inserted the pus into 2 incisions on the arm of an 8-year-old boy. The child was later deliberately exposed to smallpox to test the protective property of the cowpox inoculation. When the boy did not contract clinical smallpox, Jenner claimed that the cowpox vaccination was successful and would provide lifelong protection against smallpox. Jenner named his product after the Latin name for cow, vacca, and the idea of vaccination was born. Vaccine material could be saved by placing numerous pox scabs into a container, filling it with water and shaking it. That diluted pox scab mixture would be used to vaccinate others. From the beginning, Edward Jenner thought that genuine cowpox disease originated from the running sores of a sick horse's heels, a condition called the grease, also known as horsepox. So Jenner used horsepox to vaccinate and supplied it to others as a source of vaccine. Jenner also thought that smallpox, swinepox, cowpox, and horsepox were merely varieties of the same disease. Jenner also approved the use of goatpox, which was used to vaccinate children. In 1789, Jenner had inoculated his 18-month-old son with swinepox. Between that year and 1792, he repeatedly inoculated his son with smallpox. Possibly due to these experiments, his son was always delicate in health and died of pulmonary consumption, now known as tuberculosis, at the young age of 21. Over the years and decades, whatever vaccine material was used seemed to lose its potency, so many believed to regenerate and increase the virulence of the virus stock was to pass it through humans or animals other than a cow, such as a horse, donkey, mule, goat, sheep, or rabbit. Even buffalo was used to create vaccine material. Also, over many decades, cows were directly inoculated with smallpox from someone that had died of smallpox to make smallpox cow vaccine material. In addition, the blankets from people who died from smallpox were hung around cows' heads to make vaccine material. The ulcerated udder of a cow subject to this procedure was then scraped to get the vaccine material. The notion of regenerating supposedly fading vaccine material became known as retro-vaccination. The pus would be taken from humans and then to animals and then back to humans again. Children and young animals were preferred because they were seen as healthier and producing better vaccine material. Once a person was vaccinated with some type of concoction made from the pus of a sore on a cow, horse, goat, pig, sheep, mule, ass, buffalo, rabbit, or smallpox from a corpse scratched onto a cow or other animal, that person was used to vaccinate the next person and then the next and the next in a procedure called arm-to-arm vaccination. Vaccine material would eventually be scratched from animal to reinvigorate the vaccine stock, which was then used to vaccinate more people. On top of that, we know hygiene was virtually non-existent during the 1800s, so every vaccination on every human and every animal was mixed with whatever other microbes and assorted chemicals were on the skin and in the pus of that creature. Even by the relatively more hygienic first half of the 1900s, as many as 500 million organisms, including bacteria, yeast, and fungi, per milliliter might be present in each vaccine. By the late 1800s, large vaccine farms were established to produce vaccines. The extracted pus used for vaccination would unavoidably be mixed with blood during the collection process. Collected vaccine points collected from numerous animals would be left out in the open areas to be dried before being sent out for distribution to vaccinate millions. Even by the 1880s, vaccine farms were often crowded and unhygienic, leaving little doubt that what was termed so-called pure lymph, that was often claimed by public officials, was anything but that. So in reality, a vaccine was never really a vaccine in the sense of the word where vaca means cow. Instead, vaccination was essentially a brand name used to describe pus and blood from an entire menagerie of animals, cows, horses, goats, pigs, sheep, mules, asses, buffaloes, rabbits, and humans, including corpses of those that had died from smallpox, microbes and chemicals scratched onto people with the notion of keeping them safe from smallpox. Each scratch a person received would be a haphazard gamble as to what was in that mystery brew. The famous, often believed story is that of a country doctor, Edward Jenner, making an incredible discovery of cowpox which saved the world from smallpox. But when we look behind the curtain of this fable, we see that vaccines being used were a mix of pus and blood from a strange and varied number of human and animal sources. So knowing what this concoction called a vaccine was really made of, does it make sense to you that it could have possibly been responsible for eradicating any disease?
The accumulating resistance on the part of parents of both sexes to a law cruelly and tyrannically imposed under the existing acts by boards of guardians at the dictation of interested officials, paid agents, to violate the sanctity of conscience and the homes of a loyal and law-abiding people, while magistrates who have properly been called a terror to evil-doers have a new statutory function to fulfill in committing parents, who have done no wrong, to prison, there to associate with thieves and criminals of every type. I feel convinced, my lords and gentlemen, that when the facts concerning vaccination are known in all their bearings in relation to the life and well-being of the nation, you will arrive at the conclusion that to retain in the statute book an act compelling submission to a dangerous operation, under fine and imprisonment, is discreditable as well to hereditary, as to representative parliaments, and that you will in due time, after fair inquiry, repeal those acts. Charles T. Pierce, M.D., 1882.
Over the 1800s, vaccination, which was also highly profitable, became a widespread belief in the medical profession. Despite failures, vaccine injuries and deaths, and doctors who opposed vaccination, compulsory vaccination laws were implemented worldwide. The extensive medical acceptance of vaccination was much like what happened over 80 years for inoculation. However, unlike inoculation, vaccination laws were enacted to force people to accept this medical operation. In England, the government did not begin to enforce vaccination until the first acts in 1840 and 1853. The 1853 law set the governmental machinery in place to require every child to be vaccinated within 3 months of birth. The 1867 Vaccination Act consolidated existing laws regarding vaccination and instituted a fine for parents who did not present their children for vaccination within 3 months of birth. Yet, despite strict laws, smallpox deaths continued over the decades and culminated in a massive worldwide spike in smallpox fatalities in 1871 to 1873, despite high vaccination rates.
The deaths from smallpox have assumed the proportions of a plague. Over 10,000 lives have been sacrificed during the past year in England and Wales. In London, 5,641 deaths have occurred since Christmas. Of 9,392 patients in the London smallpox hospitals, no less than 6,854 had been vaccinated, nearly 73%. Taking the mortality at 17.5% of those attacked, and the deaths this year in the whole country at 10,000, it will follow that more than 122,000 vaccinated persons have suffered from smallpox. Can we greatly wonder that the opponents of vaccination should point to such statistics as an evidence of the failure of the system? The Lancet, July 15, 1871.
Because of the severe and sometimes fatal results of the procedure and the government's steadfast support of forced vaccination through fines and imprisonment, the people were pushed to revolt. In 1885, many people took to the streets of Leicester, England to protest. During the demonstration, thousands of prosecutions were being brought up against parents who resisted vaccination.
The widespread opposition to the enforcement of the compulsory clauses of the Vaccination Acts, which exists in Leicester, culminated yesterday in a great demonstration, which was carried out very successfully. The position which the inhabitants of the town have assumed with regard to this question is due to a variety of causes. At the present moment, there are over 5,000 persons being summoned for refusing to comply with the law. Summonses issued in the year 1884 only reached 7, or a little over 1 summons in every 2 months, while at the present moment 45 summonses are being heard and disposed of every week. But even the disposal of 45 defendants every week is not sufficient to meet the requirements of the case, and the defaulters and the objectors increase faster than the cases can be dealt with. The Times, March 24, 1885.
Thousands of brave people started a historic rebellion that successfully countered the prevailing medical belief in heavy-handed government rule. Due to mass protests, Leicester's government pushing for vaccination through fines and jail time was replaced with a new government opposed to compulsory vaccination. As a result, by 1887, the vaccination coverage rates had dropped to 10%. The medical profession proclaimed that the Leicester residents would suffer greatly for their decision to turn their backs on vaccination.
An unvaccinated child is like a bag of gunpowder which might blow up the whole school, and ought not, therefore, to be admitted to a school unless he is vaccinated. Sir Duminy Corrigan, M.D., 1871.
However, smallpox deaths continue to decline over the years, even as vaccination rates continue to decrease, spreading this rebellion movement to the rest of England and the world.
During 1896, a very mild type of smallpox began to prevail in the south and later gradually spread over the country. The mortality was very low and it, smallpox, was usually at first mistaken for chickenpox or some new disease called Cuban itch, elephant itch, Spanish measles, Japanese measles, bumps, impetigo, Puerto Rico scratches, Manila scab, Puerto Rico itch, army itch, African itch, cedar itch, Manila itch, bean itch, Dobie itch, Filipino itch, itch, kangaroo itch, Hungarian itch, Italian itch, bold hives, eruptive grip, beanpox, waterpox, or swinepox. Charles V. Chapin, 1913.
Smallpox deaths continue despite this strange mix of ingredients, all labeled as vaccines, being promoted by medical men and enforced by strict laws. This chart shows despite high levels of vaccination in Leicester, England, deaths from smallpox epidemics continued and did not decline until vaccination rates dropped. This can be seen for all of England. As vaccination rates dropped, so did smallpox deaths. This chart of deaths for various age groups in Leicester, England shows that during the time of strict vaccination laws and high vaccination rates, childhood deaths remained about the same. However, it wasn't until the 1870s and 1880s that deaths from smallpox decreased, which was the same time as the decrease in deaths caused by illnesses like measles, whooping cough, scarlet fever, typhoid, tuberculosis, and others. By the late 1800s, despite falling vaccination rates, smallpox became a mild disease similar to chickenpox. The case fatality rate, once as high as 1 in 5, fell by over 98%. Smallpox faded away and was no longer a threat, like all the other diseases that were once big killers. Despite declining vaccination rates and smallpox being considered mild and vanishing, the established medical system continued to push vaccination. Yet after over 60 years of low vaccination rates, the experiment in Leicester proved an unmitigated success.
In Leicester, England, during the 62 years since infant vaccination was abandoned, there have been only 53 deaths from smallpox, and in the past 40 years only 2 deaths. Moreover, the experience in Leicester is confirmed, and strongly confirmed, by that of the whole country. Vaccination has been steadily declining ever since the conscience clause was introduced. Until now, nearly 2/3 of the children born are not vaccinated. Yet smallpox mortality has also declined until now quite negligible. In the 14 years 1933 to 1946 there were only 28 deaths in a population of some 40 million, and among those 28 there was not a single death of an infant under 1 year of age. C. Killick Millard, MD, 1948.
The belief that vaccination was needed to stop smallpox proved not only to be untrue, but dangerous and frequently deadly.
For my own part, it is long since I have positively refused to vaccinate at any price, while the successful results of the smallpox cases I have treated are beyond appeal. In a word, I maintain that vaccination is a bauble, gilded over, indeed, by Act of Parliament, but which is a bauble still, with which doctors rock, too often to a fatal sleep, the gullible children of the world. Dr. A. H. Caron, Paris, France, 1881.
Over the many decades, countless deaths and injuries resulted from vaccination, yet these were widely ignored. This chart shows the officially recorded deaths from vaccination. From 1859 to 1922, official deaths related to vaccination totaled more than 1,600 in England alone. However, deaths due to vaccination were more often attributed to different reasons, to anything possible besides the vaccine.
Hundreds of cases are recorded in which the death of infants who were healthy up to the hour of vaccination followed, after greater or lesser periods of suffering, often horrible suffering, the insertion of vaccine. The suffering generally dating from the operation, and disease steadily advancing therefrom. The vaccinating doctors for the most part deny all connections between the vaccination and the death, and influence coroners' juries to pronounce death from some other cause. J. Garth Wilkinson, member of the Royal College of Surgeons, Edinburgh, Scotland, 1880s.
Most medical men supported vaccination, but some spoke out, highlighting vaccination failures, injuries, and deaths. Hundreds of doctors witnessed and published their observations of vaccine failures and the adverse and sometimes fatal impacts of vaccination.
I have seen hundreds of children killed by vaccination. William Hitchman, member of the Royal College of Surgeons, consulting surgeon to the Cancer Hospital Leeds, formerly a public vaccinator, Liverpool, England, late 1800s.
The multitude of those who have untimely graves, on account of this brainless abomination of modern surgery, vaccination, is a large one. Dr. C. S. Carr, editor of the Columbus Medical Journal, early 1900s.
From experience, I have seen more evils result from vaccination than I ever saw result from smallpox. In the first place, I have seen direct fatal results from vaccination. In the second place, I have seen chronic incurably chronic disease the result of vaccination, and death after the lapse of many years, and, in the third place, I have seen introduced into the system, through vaccination, diseases of a destructive character, especially syphilis. I was vaccinated when a boy, and a few years afterwards I took smallpox. I vaccinated my first 4 children. One of them died certainly from vaccination, and another was never strong after he was vaccinated. I would rather be shot than have any one of my family vaccinated. John Le Gay Brereton, Esquire, MD, member of the Royal College of Surgeons, September 20, 1881.
After 50 years' experience, I arrived at the conclusion that vaccination was not only useless as a preventative, but dangerous. I declined the risk of vaccination and would not vaccinate my bitterest enemy. Thomas Brett, MD, London, England, in a speech given on April 17, 1883.
Since blood poisoning of our children was enforced by Act of Parliament, smallpox has increased both in extent and frequency. Now vaccination by calf pox, cowpox, or humanized pox, whatever may be the multiplicity of lymphs, and pure vaccine is only a rhetorical euphemism for horse grease, is an eruptive disease, setting in with febrile symptoms, followed by papule, vesicle, and pustule, in about 8 days. And what else is smallpox? I have recently dissected more than a dozen children whose deaths were caused by vaccination, and no smallpox, however black, could have left more hideous traces of its malignant sores, foul sloughing, hearts empty or congested with clots, than did some of these little victims. Shame, indeed, scarcely a day elapses but I am called upon to witness the sufferings of vaccinated children in the form of cerebral and gastric complications, persistent vomiting, bronchitis, diarrhea, with pustules in the mouth or throat, pharynx, on the eyelids, and ulceration of the cornea, which remains opaque and may lead to blindness. William Heichman, MD, 40 years experience as a doctor of medicine, 1879.
From the History of the Reign of Queen Victoria, an English work published in the year 1900, I quote the following extract. Official statistics prove that 26,000 children have been annually slaughtered by the poisoned lancets of public vaccinators and 100,000 injured yearly by unvaccinated diseases. Bear in mind that this appalling slaughter of the innocents by the medical Herods is stated to have taken place in the British possessions alone during the reign of the late Queen Victoria. In view of this terrible slaughter of children by the vaccine lancet in the British Kingdom, what must be the aggregate number of helpless children who are annually immolated on the altar of the vaccine idol in all the generalized countries of the world? In the English Digest of Parliamentary Returns, number 488, session of 1878, entitled, Vaccination Mortality, I find recorded this appalling statement: 25,000 children are slaughtered annually by disease inoculated into the system by vaccination. J. W. Hodge, M.D., Niagara Falls, New York, 1912.
The system, vaccination, has doubtless caused more misery and mortality since its introduction by Jenner in 1798, than that caused by war, pestilence and famine. And could the dead speak, they would denounce the unclean thing in such unequivocal terms as would cause vaccinators to hide their heads in shame. C. Wardell Amerige, M.D., 1895.
Brutal suffering and deaths from vaccination were experienced by thousands, but only occasionally documented, and still more rarely with pictures of the victims.
The above photographs are of Miss Fanny Lent, of Cincinnati, Ohio. She was vaccinated when a child, and thereafter became a mass of running sores. She visited Zion City a few years ago, and has since died. She suffered the tortures of hell, and was a sight that would melt a heart of stone. These pictures tell the story of what vaccination can do, and has done in thousands of cases. The time has come to down the dirty doctors, and drive vaccination back to hell where it came from. Leaves of Healing, 1915.
Benjamin F. Olwine, Altoona, Pennsylvania. Vaccinated in winter of 1895, being then in good health and smooth and clean of skin. About 2 months later a sarcomatous tumor began to develop where the sore had not yet healed properly. The tumor continued to grow and spread until it reached the enormous proportions shown in cut, which was made from a photograph. Racked with intense pain and untold misery, suffering the most excruciating torments conceivable, the poor man was relieved only by laying down his life as a sacrifice on the altar of stupid indifference and professional incompetency. R. E. McNamara, Professor of Physiology, Chemistry, Histology, Universal Chiropractic College, 1913.
John Fander, child of healthy Swiss parents, born the 23rd of September 1875, was healthy until vaccinated. Was a sturdy and beautiful child, as were also his 4 brothers and sisters. He walked at the age of 9 months. On the 16th of June 1876, he was vaccinated by the official vaccinator. 8 days later his feet began to swell, abscesses formed, his teeth began to rot, his glands to swell. Fistulous sores appeared on his hands and feet. The above photograph was taken in May, 1882. He could neither walk nor stand. Several of the bones of his hands had rotted out. It was such cases as this and the spirit of liberty, not yet dead in Switzerland, which led that freedom-loving people to reject on a referendum the infamous system of blood poisoning, yelped vaccination, which a medical clique was seeking to impose upon them. When will the good sense, parental affection and love of liberty of Americans rise to the level of the brave burghers of Switzerland? There are thousands of such cases in this doctor-ridden land. Surely the spirit of freedom, the good sense and parental affection will soon arise and banish forever this murderous outrage and insidious cause of so much disease and death. Montague R. Leverson, M.D., 1896.
Yet with all the available information showing the deaths and injuries over the many decades from vaccination, that vaccination proved ineffective, and that smallpox deaths plummeted with it becoming as mild as chickenpox despite falling vaccination rates, the medical system's obsession with vaccination remained. By 1968, smallpox vaccination continued, with many more people being injured or killed by vaccination, all with the misguided medical notion of protecting people from smallpox while willingly sacrificing people's lives without their consent on the altar of vaccination.
The mortality and morbidity from routine infant smallpox vaccination in this country is now truly appalling when compared to the risk of smallpox. Analysis of data obtained from a review of questionnaires received from 19,616 physicians surveyed by us suggested that the estimated number of complications in 1963 was approximately 3,000. With 10 to 18 deaths among a total of 14 million persons vaccinated. The last smallpox death in the United States following an importation occurred in 1948, but since that time there have probably been 200 to 300 deaths from smallpox vaccination. The majority of workers in the field of public health sincerely feel that the current morbidity and mortality from routine vaccination is the price we have to pay for keeping our country free of smallpox. C. Henry Kemp, Professor and Chairman, Department of Pediatrics, 1968.
It is a fact that persons who never had been vaccinated have acted as nurses of smallpox patients, yet did not contract the disease, while others who had been successfully vaccinated did contract it, in such a malignant form as to lose their lives. Many persons not vaccinated at all have escaped the disease, although belonging to the same family as those afflicted, and attending them while sick, which proves that those persons were not susceptible to smallpox. Dr. C.G.R. Motu, 1905.
The mortality data and the uncovered smallpox vaccine history we have reviewed have shown us that a single germ causing an illness is not even remotely the entire story. We've learned that scratching a person with pus from someone with smallpox, or from animals with cowpox, horsepox, goatpox, or any variation of the same basic theme, accomplished little while causing widespread pain, suffering, and death. While germ theorists were focused on germs being transmitted from person to person, other doctors of the time noticed something that went against this notion. With many decades of experience, these doctors observed that sick-to-well transmission of these so-called infectious diseases did not happen to nurses, doctors, hospital workers, and their families.
All medical authorities are agreed that the risk attending the entering a room in which there are cases of infectious disease is infinitesimally small to the healthy individual, and that even where a person actually assists in removing a patient sick of an infectious disorder to another apartment or to a conveyance, while the risk is greater, it is in reality very small to the sound constitution. As a rule, it is rare to find nurses affected who live for hours and days at a time in the same atmosphere with the sick, and who at the same time make use of the simplest precautions. It is still rarer to hear of medical men sickening of infectious diseases caught in their practice, and is well known that medical men never, or very rarely, bring the infection of such diseases to their households. For 25 years I have been engaged in active sanitary work, and have had, with very limited staff, to cope with serious outbreaks of cholera, smallpox, fever, scarlatina, measles, and whooping cough, and although I have during that period brought up a large family, I have never communicated any of these diseases to my children or dependents, nor am I aware that any of the numerous sanitary inspectors who have acted under me have ever contracted or communicated these diseases while in the public service. To live in constant fear of infection is one of the surest methods of courting the risk of an attack. It is a popular, and I believe a true, saying with regard to cholera, that the fear of it kills more than the scourge itself. This holds equally good for other forms of infection. And the sanitary inspector, to be an efficient public servant, must be assured of this cardinal fact, that infectious germs of all kinds have no power of successfully attacking the healthy individual. Dr. Henry D. Littlejohn, of Edinburgh, Medical Officer to the Scottish Board of Health, 1880.
A great deal of printer's ink has of late been wasted in discussions on the spread of the so-called infectious diseases, and on the best means of preventing it. In all these discussions, public attention is more particularly drawn to smallpox. Under these circumstances, it would seem opportune to inquire, for once, how much of these opinions concerning variolous infection has been scientifically ascertained. That which is most dreaded and most eagerly combated is a volatile gaseous substance, which, fortunately, thus far has not been proved to exist outside the imagination of the learned. But when we ask whether there is a single fact that could prove the existence of such a contagion, and its power of conveying the disease, we are bound to reply in the negative. We know, as a matter of fact, that thousands of persons, though living in daily contact with variolous patients, have not caught the disease, but that one single person has ever caught it by inhaling the volatile contagion can never be proved, considering that variola, like all other diseases, can also break out spontaneously. Nevertheless, both doctors and patients cling fondly to this belief in a volatile contagion. Thus indolence, laziness, and amour propre, vanity, are the chief support of this popular belief. Unfortunately, this dogma can neither be disproved nor proved, but if it were true, if such a thing as volatile contagion really existed, it would be found in its greatest concentration and virulence in smallpox hospitals, and nothing would be more natural than that the attending doctors and nurses should be those most frequently affected by it. Yet such is not the case. Neither in the terrible epidemic of 1871, nor in any subsequent epidemic, have I heard of a single case of a doctor or a nurse catching the disease in the Vienna smallpox hospital. The remarkable immunity of hospital attendants, whatever it may prove concerning the volatile contagion, proves clearly that even the fixed contagion cannot possibly be considered as a very formidable agent. And this being so, the question arises: what is it we want to disinfect? What is it we dread? In truth, we do not know. That is the only answer we can give, or we ought to give. The belief in infection has no scientific basis, and the efficacy of disinfection is on a par with that of vaccination and revaccination, which even credulous physicians are beginning to doubt. Dr. Lorenzer, one of the leading physicians of Vienna, 1880.
The Great Hospital for Consumption at Brompton, London, in existence for over 60 years, is the largest hospital for lung diseases in the world. It has a large staff of physicians, with scores of nurses and other hospital attendants. If consumption, tuberculosis, was infectious, it certainly would show itself among those in such close and constant contact with it, in all its worst and most advanced stages. And yet Dr. Williams, the senior physician, says, infection in the wards of the hospital between consumptives and non-consumptives is unknown. My own personal experience for more than 50 years of active professional life, the chief part of which has been given to the study and treatment of lung diseases as a specialty, each day being spent in the examination of their chests, analyzing their sputa, saliva mixed with mucus or pus, expectorated from the lungs and respiratory passages, exposed at all times to their breath and to emanations from their bodies, with the expectorations always in my cuspidors, place for spitting, show conclusively that it is not infectious and cannot be communicated by association. I have never in my 50 years of practice met with an instance of infection, or seen anything to make me believe it could be communicated from the sick to the well. With the records of over 50,000 cases so examined and treated by me, I am able to speak with all confidence and assured judgment in saying that there is no warrant or foundation for any belief consumption is infectious or communicable in any degree or under any circumstances whatever. The assumption that it can be communicated is disproved by the statistics of consumption in all civilized lands, by the reports of consumption hospitals and all institutions for the treatment of lung diseases, and by the united clinical experience of scientific specialists throughout the civilized worlds who have made lung diseases a life study. No physician can believe consumption is infectious without discrediting the annals of his own profession, the teachings of its leading authorities, and the overwhelming judgment of the great body of medical practitioners. In the face of these facts, the setting up of this bogey and fake infection was an outrage and crime against truth, science and humanity. Consumption is not infectious, it is not communicated from sick to the well. And it can neither be prevented nor cured by segregation in pest hospitals. Robert Hunter, M.D., 1897.
These expert testimonies that cover many decades demonstrate that diseases that most believe are highly contagious did not appear to be transmitted from someone sick to someone that wasn't, but were their experiments proving sick-to-well disease transmission.
Majorities are never a proof of the truth. Dr. Walter R. Hadwin, 1896.
In 1919, what was categorized as a flu pandemic swept the planet. The skin of the people affected by this disease turned blue, and their lungs filled with fluids. Victims died within hours or days of symptom onset. Unusually, young adults were among the hardest hit group, which usually remains unaffected by this type of epidemic. A fifth of the victims suffered mild symptoms, but the rest became gravely ill and often died. In an attempt to better understand disease transmission, 5 sick-to-well studies were performed. The doctors were confident they fully understood this disease was highly contagious, yet what they found completely surprised and perplexed them.
These tests were rigorous to say the least. First, the subjects were injected with infected lung tissue taken from the dead and then sprayed in the eyes, nose, and mouth with infectious aerosols. If they still failed to succumb, they had their throats swabbed with discharges taken from the sick and dying. If all else failed, they were required to sit open-mouthed while a gravely ill victim was helped to cough into their faces. None contracted the flu, not one. Bill Bryson, A Short History of Nearly Everything, 2003.
Almost 100 years after these studies, the seemingly apparent sick-to-well flu transmission was still not verified. This strongly held entrenched belief has yet to be proved.
In 2003, Bridges et al. Reviewed influenza transmission and found no human experimental studies published in the English-language literature delineating person-to-person transmission of influenza. However, according to Jordan's frightening monograph on the 1918 pandemic, there were 5 attempts to demonstrate sick-to-well influenza transmission in the desperate days following the pandemic, and all were singularly fruitless. Jordan reports that all 5 studies failed to support sick-to-well transmission, in spite of having numerous acutely ill influenza patients, in various stages of their illness, carefully cough, spit, and breathe on a combined total of greater than 150 well patients. John J. Cannell, et al. On the Epidemiology of Influenza, Virology Journal, February 2008.
Because of this deeply embedded notion of transmitting infectious disease, masking has long been believed to stop the spread and reduce the numbers that become ill. However, while masking was often forced onto the population, masking to prevent the spread of disease has still not been proven after decades of mass studies.
I'm the first author of a Cochrane review that's been looking at things like masks since 2006. We've had 4 updates and we're beginning to have the 5th one. The good, better quality studies, there's 15 of them before COVID was identified, and they don't seem to show any effect in masks, either versus nothing, compared to nothing, or compared to other types of masks.
Expert observations of doctors failing to show sick-to-well transmission of disease, a lack of experiments demonstrating healthy people getting sick from those with a specific illness, and the failure to demonstrate that masking is effective in stopping transmission of disease add more evidence that microbes are not the cause of illnesses people have suffered from.
Part of the blame of over-medication rests, as I have said, with the profession in yielding to the tendency to self-delusion, which seems almost inseparable from the practice.
In our mode of inference, too often adopted, of counting only our favorable cases and in falling into the not uncommon error known in scholastic phrase as post hoc ergo propter hoc. The patient got well after taking my medicines. Therefore, he got well because of taking them. The greater portion of this blame, however, rests properly with the public, which insists on its right to be poisoned by somebody. Like Barnum of illustrious memory, they believe in and practice on the measureless gullibility of a public which actually enjoys being humbugged. The whole dishonest and shameless business is built, as on a rock, upon the popular delusion that sick people must feed upon noxious substances. The more, the better; the nastier, the more effective. The outside pressure upon the physician is very great, tending to force him to active treatment, whether in his judgment necessary or not. Some error of diet, some improper habit of the patient, may only need correction, and the administration of drugs be unnecessary or hurtful. H. Brown, M.D., Huntsville, Kentucky, 1892.
Other diseases were once considered infectious for the same reasons as measles, smallpox, etc. Basically, sick people were found around other sick people, creating the notion that a disease was spreading. For example, pellagra resulted in roughly 3 million cases in the United States, with 100,000 deaths from 1904 to 1940. Many believed pellagra to be caused by a virus.
Pellagra is a specific disease of man characterized by clinical manifestations on the part of the digestive tract, the nervous system and the skin. Pellagra requires for its spread not only old peregrines to furnish the virus and susceptible new victims to receive it, but also special conditions to facilitate the transfer. It appears that the infectious agent leaves the body in the feces or urine or both and gains access to the new victim by contamination of food. W. J. McNeil, Ph.D., M.D., 1922.
Beriberi was another disease that was once considered by many to be infectious. It was estimated that in the early 1900s, the deaths from beriberi in the Orient amounted to 100,000 annually.
As the result of several years of clinical and pathological experience of beriberi in the Malay Peninsula and other parts of the Far East, I have been forced to the conclusion that beriberi is an acute infectious disease. Microscopically, a varying degree of necrosis of the mucosa was discovered, accompanied by more or less marked signs of acute inflammation, and in the necrosed mucosa a special bacillus of constant morphological character was found. I believe that beriberi is thus analogous to diphtheria. It should not be forgotten that, from May 1, 1902, to the present time, the prisoners have been on a diet of lower grade in the nitrogen content than obtained during the previous year or so, during which beriberi was almost epidemic. This fact should set at rest the question of diet as a factor in the causation of beriberi. Hamilton Wright, M.D., 1905.
Yet we now know that these two diseases are essentially nutritional deficiencies. Pellagra was due to vitamin B3 or niacin deficiency, and beriberi was due to vitamin B1 deficiency. As such, did we miss this lesson and believe that only specific microbes cause other diseases such as smallpox, measles, the flu, etc.? Or, as mortality data indicates, are these diseases more in line with nutritional deficiencies or some error in health? We have seen the experience of doctors over many decades found that infectious diseases, smallpox, fevers of all types, measles, whooping cough, tuberculosis, etc., did not cause illnesses in those that were the primary caregivers to the sick, doctors, nurses, and hospital staff, nor did they transmit these diseases to their families. The attempts to prove transmission from the sick to the well have also failed. The strategy to protect people by stopping the supposed infectious microbe using masks has also failed. We have largely forgotten that diseases like pellagra, once considered contagious, were about the individual's health. So do we need to rethink our notion of catching an illness? However, one key point to consider was the observation by Dr. Henry D. Littlejohn that
to live in constant fear of infection is one of the surest methods of courting the risk of an attack.
In our current fear-soaked world concerning diseases and other issues we face as a planet, how much pain, suffering, and death can we lay at the feet of fear and those that continuously spread the fear message? A final note from Florence Nightingale, an English social reformer and the founder of modern nursing.
Facts are everything. Doctrines are nothing. See what harm German pathologists have done us. There are not specific diseases. There are specific disease conditions. It is that which is bringing the medical profession to grief, and will in time work a great reform, to wit, to make the public care for its own health and not rely on doctrines. It is a grand thing for weak minds, the doctrine of contagion. The specific disease doctrine is the grand refuge of weak, uncultured, unstable minds, such as now rule in the medical profession. Florence Nightingale, April 1866.
The good old days, when everything, in particularly human health, was supposedly better than it is today, are a myth. The documented history of Western civilization describes an endless and unromantic struggle with sickness and death. Tragically high infant mortality and the premature death of young adults. Death-dealing epidemics attacked helpless communities nearly as often as summer and winter came to pass, and were followed every few years by major catastrophes. In Victorian England, the average age of death among the urban poor was 15 to 16 years. Velv W. Green, Ph.D., 2001.
Many of us have a picture of the 1800s, colored by a myriad of filters that impart a nostalgic and romantic view of that era. You may picture a time when gentlemen callers arrived to meet a well-dressed lady in a finely furnished parlor. A time where people leisurely drifted down a river on a paddle-wheel riverboat while sipping mint juleps. A time of more elegant travel aboard a steam train passing through the beautiful countryside, or a stylish woman dressed in a long flowing gown descending from a sleek horse-drawn carriage with the aid of a dapper companion in a top hat. You may think of those times where life was simple and ordered, a seeming utopia, free of the many woes that plague modern society. But if those filters are removed, and a more objective light is cast upon that time, a different picture emerges. Instead, imagine a world where workplaces had no health, safety, or minimum wage laws. The 1800s was a century when people put in 12 to 16 hours a day at the most tedious menial labor. Imagine bands of children roaming the streets out of control because their parents were laboring long days. Children were also involved in dangerous and demoralizing work. Picture the city of New York surrounded not by suburbs, but by rings of smoldering garbage dumps and shanty towns. Cities where hogs, horses, and dogs and their refuse were commonplace in the streets. Many infectious diseases were rampant throughout the world, particularly in the larger cities. This is not a description of the Third World, but a large portion of what the United States and other civilized Western countries used to be only a century or so ago.
Now from all parts the swelling kennels flow, and bear their trophies with them as they go. Filth of all hues and odor, seem to tell what street they sailed from, by their sight and smell. They, as each torrent drives with rapid force, from Smithfield to St. Pancras shape their course. And in huge confluence joined at Snow Hill Ridge, fall from the conduit prone to Holborn Bridge. Sweeping from butchers' stalls, dung, guts, and blood, drowned puppies, stinking sprats, all drenched in mud, dead cats, and turnip tops, come tumbling down the flood. Jonathan Swift, A Description of a City Shower, in London, 1712.
A Description of Glasgow, Scotland, in 1841. It consists of a labyrinth of narrow lanes or wynds, a very narrow street, whence numberless entrances lend off to small squares, courts, or closets, which usually have a human dunghill in the centre. These wynds and courts are formed of old, ill-ventilated, and mostly dilapidated houses, varying from 2 to 4 stories in height, without water, and let out in stories or flats, one of the latter often serving for the residence of 2 or 3 families. Frequently, however, the flats are let out in lodgings, as many as 15 or 20 individuals being occasionally found huddled together in a single room. Filth, destitution, and misery prevail to a frightful extent. 30th Annual Report of the Registrar General, 1869.
In winter, more than 1 million chimneys breathe forth simultaneously smoke, soot, sulfurous acid, vapor of water, and carbonic acid gas, and the whole town fumes like a vast crater, at the bottom of which its unhappy citizens must creep and live as best they can. Francis Albert Rollo Russell, London Fogs, 1880.
For it was the custom, as they found, whenever meat was so spoiled, that it could not be used for anything else, either to can it or else to chop it up into sausage. There was never the least attention paid to what was cut up for sausage. There would come all the way back from Europe old sausage that had been rejected, and that was moldy and white. It would be dosed with borax and glycerin, and dumped into the hoppers, and made over again for home consumption. There would be meat that had tumbled out on the floor, in the dirt and sawdust, where the workers had tramped and spit. There would be meat stored in great piles in rooms, and the water from leaky roofs would drip over it, and thousands of rats would race about on it. It was too dark in these storage places to see well, but a man could run his hand over these piles of meat and sweep off handfuls of the dried dung of rats. These rats were nuisances, and the packers would put poisoned bread out for them. They would die, and then rats, bread, and meat would go into the hoppers together. The Jungle, Upton Sinclair, 1906.
In the Western world, many children enjoy what we have come to define as a normal childhood. They generally get up in the morning and have a reasonable breakfast, and then, during the majority of the year, attend school. In public and private schools, they are educated in math, science, languages, and other areas of study. While in school, they are fed, and all their basic needs are usually met. They often have a chance to experience art, music, and physical education, and to play games at recess. During the balance of the day, they may interact with their friends, play games, enjoy sports, watch television, play with their pets, or engage in an entire host of other leisure activities. At night, they sleep in a relatively safe environment. In the summer months, they often enjoy long, leisurely days playing, and may even take vacations with their family. Although this life is not enjoyed by all, and may not be perfect, it is far more common in the developed world than it used to be. During the 1800s and into the 1900s, life for many children in the United States and England was that of long and brutal hours of hard labor and poverty. Their lives were not filled with joy and laughter, but often with suffering and crushing misery. From the late 1700s into the 1800s, machines frequently replaced manual labor for the production of most manufactured goods. With the large number of factories, the owners needed sources of cheap labor, which was often found in the form of children. Many machines did not need adult strength to operate, so children could be hired more inexpensively than adults. Factory work for children was abusive and demoralizing.
Children of all ages down to 3 and 4 were found in the hardest and most painful labor, while babes of 6 were commonly found in large numbers in many factories. Labor from 12 to 13, and often 16 hours a day, was the rule. Children had not a moment free, save to snatch a hasty meal or sleep as best as they could. From earliest youth, they worked to a point of extreme exhaustion, without open-air exercise or any enjoyment whatever, but grew up, if they survived at all, weak, bloodless, miserable, and in many cases deformed cripples and victims of almost every disease. Child labor, March 1890.
The challenges faced by people before the mid-1900s were nothing short of harrowing. with a range of issues causing widespread health problems. Horrifying housing conditions left many people living in cramped and unsanitary conditions, while the lack of proper systemic sanitation and hygiene practices only served to exacerbate the problem. Hard labor, often carried out for extremely long hours in hazardous conditions, was the norm, with children not spared from the grueling nature of work. Inadequate access to nutrient-rich foods led to widespread malnutrition and stunted growth, further weakening already vulnerable bodies. To top it all off, toxic pollution from homes and factories only added to the many health hazards people faced on a daily basis. The impact of these challenges was most acutely felt by those living in poverty, who were left to endure the worst of it. It's little wonder that people frequently suffered from tuberculosis, smallpox, measles, and a variety of other diseases.
The most deadly feature of the new towns was the close proximity of human beings to each other. For example, the report of a health officer for Darlington in the 1850s found 6 children, aged between 2 and 17, suffering from smallpox in a one-roomed dwelling shared with their parents, an elder brother and an uncle. They all slept together on rags on the floor, with no bed. Millions of similar cases could be cited, with conditions getting even worse as disease victims died and their corpses remained rotting among families in single-roomed accommodations for days, as the family scraped together the pennies to bury them. Dorothy Porter, Ph.D. 1999.
However, the winds of change were blowing, and a new era of progress was on the horizon that promised to transform this bleak and horrifying landscape into a world of unprecedented progress and prosperity. It was the start of the world's greatest health revolution.
It is not strange that health improves when the population gives up using diluted sewage as the principal beverage. Dr. Thurman Rice, 1932.
By the mid-1800s, slums had become commonplace settlements in the Western world. New York City had 100,000 slum dwellers living in 20,000 tenement buildings. They were a crowded and vile predicament. Throughout these unsanitary slums, death was ever present. Cholera, typhoid, scarlet fever, smallpox, typhus, and other infectious diseases were never idle. But during this time, the seeds of change were sowed and slowly took root. It was the beginning of the sanitation revolution. A new understanding that filth contributed to human illness had come to light. It was also known that poverty was often a result of such illness, and not just the cause. Based on this awareness, projects for the supply of clean water and removal of human and other waste gradually began to be implemented.
20% of pauperism was due to fever, and the blame fell on overcrowding, negligent waste disposal, dirty water and bad diet. Poverty could not be abolished, but poverty due to preventable disease could be. The primary and most important measures, and at the same time the most practicable, and within the recognized province of administration, are drainage, the removal of all refuse from habitations, streets and roads, and the improvement of the supplies of water. Historian Roy Porter, 1997.
To address public health concerns, local government began setting standards for the protection of human health. Social reformers, activists, doctors, and others pushed for change to improve the general well-being of the population. Governments began to focus on removal of waste, supplying the population with clean water, and a whole host of other issues dealing with health.
The present generation is beginning to learn and will realize more thoroughly as time wears on that the fatalistic idea with regard to contagious and infectious disease is absolutely erroneous. That many so-called unavoidable diseases are positively preventable. It is not true each individual must run the gamut of measles, scarlet fever, whooping cough, diphtheria, tuberculosis, and the like. If proper precautionary measures be taken at the outset, sunshine, fresh air, wholesome nutrition, exercise, rest, and the hygienic mode of living are far more effectual than all the subsequent medication in existence. Oral Hygiene, 1911.
By the mid-1900s, a tremendous positive societal transformation had taken place through the efforts and struggle of millions. They implemented pipes for clean water, sewers for managing human and animal waste, established hand washing and basic hygiene, replaced dreadful slums with decent housing, moved industries from centers of cities, improved milk supplies, better child care practices, labor and child labor laws, public schools replaced child labor, health departments, proper food handling, vastly improved nutrition, electricity, refrigeration, transportation, the flush toilet, and many other scientific advances, and tackled water and air pollution. Together, these changes enabled people to live free of the old risks of disease they had been plagued with for decades. Millions of lives have been transformed from endless hard labor, filthy housing, lack of clean water, fresh air and sunshine, non-existent sanitation, and abysmal nutrition to a life of health, prosperity, and happiness undreamed of only a few decades earlier.
All of the old menaces like typhoid, smallpox, measles, scarlet fever, whooping cough and diphtheria have become minor causes of death. The chance is very remote indeed that any of them will ever again assume sufficient importance in the mortality tables seriously to affect the general death rate. Dr. Lewis Dublin, 1935.
With so many changes occurring due to massive public health initiatives, the dreadful living situation for multitudes dramatically improved by the mid-1900s. Sanitary infrastructure, understanding of hygiene, vastly improved nutrition, labor laws, scientific advances, and many other factors coalesced to create a radical shift. As a result, children who were once dying from diarrhea and common infectious diseases were living and thriving in greater numbers within the span of several decades.
Measles, scarlet fever, whooping cough, and diphtheria, the principal communicable diseases of childhood, declined 31% in the year, or from 4.2 per 100,000 in 1939 to 2.9 in 1940. Each of these diseases reached a new minimum in 1940, and all except whooping cough had a mortality rate of less than 1 per 100,000. Only a comparatively few years ago the death toll from this group of diseases was serious, but it has now been reduced to a point where their complete suppression may be expected. The public health movement is said to be responsible for the reduction in mortality from diarrhea and enteritis, which in 1930 had a rate of 20.4 per 100,000 and in 1940 had dropped to a rate of 4.6. Advances in sanitary science, including the pasteurization of milk, the better refrigeration of foods, and the purification of water supplies, as well as the general rise in the standard of living, are the main reasons for this improvement. Handbook of Labor Statistics, 1941 edition, U.S. Department of Labor.
Again, what about smallpox? In the early 2000s, Dr. Mack testified that his professional background included extensive experience working with smallpox outbreaks in populations, likely more than virtually anybody ever has. He stated that smallpox disappeared due to advancements and societal improvements rather than universal vaccination.
Disappearance of smallpox was facilitated, not impeded, by economic development. Long before the World Health Organization's smallpox eradication program began, and despite low herd immunity, unsophisticated public health facilities, and repeated introductions, smallpox disappeared from many countries as they developed economically, among them Thailand, Egypt, Mexico, Bolivia, Sri Lanka, Turkey, and Iraq. If people are worried about endemic smallpox, it disappeared from this country not because our mass herd immunity. It disappeared because our economic development. And that's why it disappeared from Europe and many other countries. And it will not be sustained here, even if there were several importations, I'm sure. It's not from universal vaccination. Thomas Mack MD, 2002 and 2003.
So, with all we have learned thus far, is there really anything to fear from smallpox and, for that matter, any of these so-called infectious diseases? All these changes over the many decades ushered in the greatest health revolution in human history. But unfortunately, this history has largely been forgotten and replaced with the notion that medication and vaccination 100% solved the problem and saved us. Do you think they have? Yet there was an insidious and pervasive factor that had caused a great deal of suffering, pain, and death, often laying the blame onto these diseases. That factor was the medical man.
Thousands are annually slaughtered in the quiet sickroom. Governments should at once either banish medical men and prescribe condemn their blundering art, or they should adopt some better means to protect the lives of the people than at present prevail, when they look far less after the practice of this dangerous profession and the murders committed in it than after the lowest trades. Dr. Frank, eminent European author and practitioner, 1800s.
Not only did the many positive changes from the latter 1800s into the mid-1900s result in a massive decline in mortality from smallpox, measles, whooping cough, scarlet fever, etc., but another major factor was also causing deaths for centuries: the medical treatments themselves.
For upwards of 23 centuries, to starve, bleed, purge, and torture had been the all but exclusive business of the man of medicine. From the days of Hippocrates till within the last few years, this was the undoubted practice in almost all diseases. In truth, what from the gloom of the sickroom, and what from the obscurity that enveloped the science, no question was ever asked by the public at large about medical matters. The possession of a diploma or degree from a school or university of reputation was the only requisite for practice. The practice itself, no matter how destructive, signified little so long as it was the established practice. Samuel Dixon, M.D., Glasgow, 1855.
Less than 35 years ago, 1850, millions of human beings up to that time had gone to untimely graves, begging piteously for a cup of water to cool their parched lips, while the burning fire of fever was consuming their lives. Doctors in those days said, "Cold water is death, do not give a drop. Give the patient a dose of calomel, mercury, and a spoonful of warm water." Not only were fever patients denied cold water, nature's remedy, but light and pure air were also denied them, and they were drugged with calomel, physicked with jalap, a strong purgative, depleted of their lifeblood by the lancet, and starved until they gave up the ghost, a tribute to this medical delusion. Alexander Milton Ross, M.D., Toronto, 1888.
The single, uncombined, different, and confessed poisons in daily use by the dominant school of medicine number 107. Among these are phosphorus, strychnine, mercury, opium, and arsenic. The various combinations of these 5 violent poisons number, respectively, 27 combinations of phosphorus, 5 of strychnia, 47 of mercury, 25 of opium, and 14 of arsenic. The poisons that are more or less often used number many hundreds. Dr. Brodie, Chicago, author of Medical Practice Without Poisons, late 1800s.
Mankind has been drugged to death, and the world would be better off if the contents of every apothecary shop were emptied into the sea, though the consequences to the fishes would be lamentable. The disgrace of medicine has been the colossal system of self-deception, in obedience to which minds have been emptied of their cankering minerals, the entrails of animals taxed for their impurities, the poisoned bags of reptiles drained of their venom, and all the inconceivable abominations thus obtained thrust down the throats of human beings suffering from some fault of organization, nourishment, or vital stimulation. Dr. Oliver Wendell Holmes, 1860s.
Keeping people deprived of water and fresh air, often drained of blood until fainting, using toxic medicines like mercury and arsenic and other harmful notions killed vast numbers. However, those deaths were never recorded as medically caused. Instead, countless souls died, counted as having died of a disease the doctor was treating.
More harm than good has been done by the use of drugs in the treatment of measles, scarlatina, and other self-limited diseases. In their zeal to do good, physicians have done much harm. They have hurried thousands to the grave who would have recovered if left to nature. Professor Alonzo Clark, MDU, New York College of Physicians and Surgeons, 1800s.
The drugs administered for scarlet fever destroys far more than that disease does. Dr. B.F. Barker, New York Medical College, 1800s.
The art of healing is like an unroofed building, uncovered at the top and cracked at the foundation. I am incessantly led to make apology for the instability of the theories and practice of physic. Dissections daily convince us of our ignorance of disease, and cause us to blush at our prescription. What mischief have we not done under the belief of false facts and false theories? We have assisted in multiplying diseases. We have done more, we have increased their fatality. Benjamin Rush, M.D., University of Pennsylvania, signatory to the U.S. Declaration of Independence, 1700s.
The science of medicine is barbarous jargon, and the effects of our medicines on the human system are in the highest degree uncertain, except that they have already destroyed more lives than war, pestilence and famine combined. Dr. John Mason Good, early 1800s.
Physicians have slain more than war. As instruments of death in their hands, calomel, bleeding, and other medicines have done more than powder and ball. The public would be infinitely better off without professed physicians. Dr. Eliphalet Kimball, New Hampshire, author of Thoughts on Natural Principles, 1867.
By the late 1800s, many recognized that fresh air, sunshine, clean water, not bleeding someone to the point of passing out, avoiding toxic medications, and stopping other wrong-headed medical notions were in the patient's best interests. Once many of these horrifying, destructive practices fell out of use, so did many deaths from the diseases they intended to treat. Much like it has happened in previous centuries, medical errors are still rarely acknowledged. Today, 250,000 people die annually in the United States alone due to medical errors. Yet the CDC and other medical organizations simply ignore medical errors.
For the better part of 2 decades, there's been a growing recognition that medical errors kill too many patients in the U.S. While exact numbers are elusive, a new analysis and estimate portrays an even grimmer picture. The new paper finds that as many as 250,000 people die each year from errors in hospitals and other healthcare facilities. That would make it the 3rd leading cause of death in the U.S., ahead of respiratory disease, accidents, and even stroke. Dr. Martin Makary, a professor of surgery at the Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine, who led the research, joins me now.
It turns out that we learned that the CDC does not consider medical error to be a cause of death in listing our national health statistics each year, even though the point estimate comes right in between number 2 and number 3 on the list, which means medical error is the number 3 cause of death in the United States. We're just not measuring it. These are studies of hundreds of thousands of hospitalizations in the top medical journals, and they are updating the 1999 Institute of Medicine report. And there's broad consensus that the range is somewhere between 200 and 400,000. Our analysis came up with 251,000. No matter what number you pick, it's well above the currently listed number 3 cause of death.
According to a 2013 article published in the Journal of Patient Safety, Dr. John T. James reports that patient adverse events, his politically correct term for hospital medical mistakes, contribute to the death of approximately 440,000 patients in America each year. That's roughly 1/6 of the 2.5 million total deaths that occur in the United States each year. 37% of Americans die outside of hospitals. So, in fact, hospital medical errors contribute to the death of roughly 1/4 of all patients who die in U.S. hospitals.
The people the world over desire health, but they have been misled by shadows and imagery until their minds have become thoroughly bound into the old traditionary forms of practice. And today there are many millions who hardly think for themselves in matters of health. There has grown in the United States of America in the past 20 years an enormous sentiment favoring absolute freedom in the choice of physician and the choice and mode of practice. The battle between the drug doctors and the drugless physicians has grown to be a real battle everywhere, and today, about 40% of the people of the United States are demanding the right of choice, and we don't doubt that they will secure everything they demand, and that within a few years. Compulsory vaccination laws, typhoid serum, another terrible curse, and poisonous form of inoculation or medication will have been relegated to the dump heaps of the past. Vaccination has never been anything but a delusion, maintained only by professional greed and a misunderstanding entirely to the physical health and needs of humanity. Once these rules are fully understood, no respectable physician will be guilty of practicing vaccination, either on children or adults. Joe Shelby Riley, M.D., M.S., Ph.D., author of Conquering Units, or The Mastery of Disease, 1921.
With this crucial information in mind, it's natural to ask some important questions. Why isn't this information more widely known? Why aren't governments, institutions, companies, organizations, and the media highlighting this information? Where are the investigations, documentaries, and public hearings on this topic? Why don't organizations such as the CDC, World Health Organization, doctors, pediatricians, and others prominently displaying these charts and making this information more widely available? Why are medical journals not providing this information to their readers? If over 98% to 100% of measles deaths were prevented without injections, why was a new method using injections implemented and made mandatory for everyone? Does this massive decline in measles deaths without injections disprove germ theory? If something so fundamental and easily accessible has been missed or ignored, what other important information have authorities and experts mishandled? How could data hidden in plain sight have been missed or ignored for so long? How can we trust these systems and the information they provide if they are not transparent and forthcoming with such important knowledge? These are important questions that deserve to be examined and answered. It highlights the importance of critical thinking, questioning, and investigation in understanding the facts and making informed decisions. Only by doing so can we hope to uncover the truth and make better decisions for ourselves, our communities, and our world. Once we realize the illusion we have been living under for decades, we can break free and take control of our own health and happiness. We don't have to live in fear. We don't have to live under a totalitarian medical state where we are treated like criminals because we don't believe the prevailing medical dogma disguised as science. It is essential to be vigilant and stay informed. For only through knowledge and understanding can we hope to find the truth, be empowered, and truly be free. We must question the information presented to us, do our own research, and be critical of the sources of information. Only by doing so can we hope to make informed decisions and live the life we want. We can take back the power we have so freely given away. We can stop being obedient followers and start being informed and educated individuals. We can take control of our own lives, make our own choices, and live the way we want to. We can be healthier, happier, and at peace. We can be free.
It is difficult to conceive what will be the excuse for a century of cowpoxing, but it cannot be doubted that the practice will appear in as absurd a light to the common sense of the 20th century as bloodletting now does to us. Vaccination differs, however, from all previous eras of the faculty in being maintained as the law of the land on the warrant of medical authority. That is the reason why the blow to professional credit can hardly help being severe, and why the efforts to ward it off have been, and will continue to be, so ingenious. Dr. Charles Creighton, M.D., Professor, University of Cambridge, 1889.